Welcome to Nobody Told Me. I'm Laura Owens.
And I'm Jan Black. Joining us on this episode is award-winning journalist and best-selling author Lisa McCubbin, whose latest book is called Betty Ford, First Lady, Women's Advocate, Survivor, Trailblazer. It's been called the landmark biography of one of the most admired and influential women of our time.
Lisa, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So what made you interested in learning more about the life of Betty Ford? You said you felt like she orchestrated this whole process.
I really do. My editor, Mitchell Ivers, came to me with this idea. I had done 4 different books with Mitchell Ivers and was kind of looking for a new project to do on my own. And he said, Betty Ford died in 2011, and there hasn't been a proper biography written of her. And I think, Lisa, you're the right person to do it. So it kind of came at me out of the blue, and I said, let me think about it because I really have to have a passion for my subject. I know I'm going to devote at least 2 years of my life to it. So I went on a long walk, and I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the Fords both hail from Grand Rapids, Michigan. And on my walk, I kid you not, it seemed every person I ran into was wearing a University of Michigan sweatshirt or T-shirt.
Wow.
And so those were kind of the signs I was getting at first. And then from then on out, it just, one thing led to another. It just became so easy to get involved in her life. And I felt like she was just carrying me every step of the way, from meeting her daughter, Susan. And then Susan put me in touch with everybody else. And it just went very easily.
Tell us more about the research you did for the book.
Well, I first went to the Gerald Ford Presidential Library in Ann Arbor, which is on the campus of the University of Michigan, and, just started delving into some of the papers. The interesting thing was that it's a presidential library, and it's mostly about the president. They had very little on Betty Ford. They had boxes and boxes of her things that the children had donated to the museum after Betty Ford died in 2011, but the staff hadn't actually gone through all this stuff. And so I said, look, I've got to get this book done. I want to go through some of this stuff. So they actually allowed me to see some things before anybody else had. And I got to go through boxes of memorabilia that Betty Ford had kept, like her handwritten notes that she took when she went to the Bennington College School of Dance and studied under Martha Graham in the 1930s. And those little things I could see her passion for dance and, just the kinds of things that she kept in her scrapbook. It really gave me an insight into the things that were important to her.
And what did you find out about who she truly was as a person?
Oh, gosh. I wish I had known her. Everybody said she was just so much fun. She had a great sense of humor. She was very outspoken, very candid. She told it like it is. And if somebody asked her a question, she just was honest. She came from a background of a strong mother. Her mother pretty much raised her to be a strong woman. She had 2 older brothers, and her father was a traveling salesman, so he was gone most of the time. And when she was 16, actually, her father committed suicide. He had lost his job in the Depression. So that was, a real turning point for her, and I think really must have had a lasting impact on her, and realizing that she had to be her own independent woman because she saw that you couldn't rely on a man to take care of you, as was the case for most women at that time.
Tell us more about the impact her father's death had on Betty Ford's life as a teenager and as a grown woman.
Well, it was something she didn't talk about. I interviewed all 4 of her children. She had 3 sons and a daughter, the daughter being the youngest, Susan. And they said that Betty didn't ever talk about her father. Her mother ended up remarrying, and she would talk about him, her stepfather, who she became close to. But it seemed like it was almost one of those things that was just so painful. She had put it in the past and didn't really talk about it. So it's not clear how much it impacted her.
I saw an interview with you where you said that when you interviewed her children, you asked all of them the same question to start out. What was that question?
The question was, what words come to mind when you think of your mother? And Susan Ford Bales, the first word she said was silly. And that really surprised me because
Interesting.
I don't think of Betty Ford as being silly, but she really was, she liked to goof around and have a good time, play practical jokes, just had a great sense of humor. But she was also, loving, motherly, generous, kind, compassionate, had a deep faith, very deep faith, and that was important to her, and that's woven throughout the book as well.
Did your opinion of Betty Ford change at all from the time you first started your research to the time when you submitted your manuscript?
Oh, absolutely. When I first started, I really didn't know anything about her other than that she had been First Lady and that, she started the Betty Ford Center. So I found out so many things about her, that she had been a dancer with Martha Graham when she was in her 20s. She went to New York City. And think of this. This is 1938, and she's 20 years old, and she goes to New York City to dance with Martha Graham from Grand Rapids on her own. And so she was very independent. She didn't end up making Martha Graham's company, the First Round company, because Betty liked to socialize. She liked to date, and Martha Graham said, you can't have a social life and be a dancer at the same time. So Betty wound up sort of on the second team, the auxiliary club, and realized that she wasn't willing to make dance her entire life. So that was one of the things I found that was, so interesting. She also was married and divorced before she met Gerald Ford. So she had been married for 5 years before. They had no children. It turned out that her first husband was very much like her father, a traveling salesman, and also an alcoholic. And she ended up getting divorced from him, thinking that she was never going to marry again. And that's when Jerry Ford showed up and swept her off her feet.
Yeah, can you tell us more about that story, about how they got together?
So they were, she was 30 years old at the time, which, was kind of an old maid at that time to, not be married and have children. And Jerry was 35. He had been a war hero, come back to Grand Rapids. He was a lawyer, and he was ready to settle down. He had seen Betty at some dances and thought she was very attractive. And he asked some friends to give him her phone number. He called her up one night and said, hey, come meet me for a drink. And she was working at a local department store as a fashion coordinator. And she said, I can't meet you. I've got a fashion show tomorrow. And actually, my divorce isn't quite final, so it just wouldn't be right. Well, he wore her down, convinced her, and she said, okay, just for 20 minutes, I'll go have a drink with you. And before you knew it, it was well over an hour. And, they were just talking and hit it off immediately. And about 9 months later, they were married.
And how did she feel about Gerald Ford getting into politics?
Well, she didn't know at first. When he asked her to marry him, he said, we can't get married right away because there's something I want to do and I can't tell you what it is. What it was he was going to do was run for Congress. And finally he did tell her, and she said, I didn't know what running for Congress meant, but I thought if Jerry wanted to do it, then it must be okay. And she really didn't think he was going to win because her image of a congressman was an old white-haired man in Washington, D.C. Well, sure enough, Jerry won. And 2 weeks after they were married in October of 1948, they went to Washington, D.C., and that's where they spent the next 28 years.
Did you know that 88% of financially successful people read at least 30 minutes per day? Reading is the ultimate secret to success, and lots of people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates credit their success directly to reading. The problem is, there's no time to read, right?
If you're like us, the list of books you want to read or those people suggest you read is never ending and always expanding. You simply don't have time to read them all. Our sponsor, Blinkist, has solved your long list of must-reads once and for all.
Blinkist is the only app that takes thousands of the best-selling nonfiction books and distills them down to their most impactful elements, so you can read or listen to them in under 15 minutes, all on your phone. I'm in the car a lot, and I like to listen to Blinkist when I'm driving.
I'm in the gym often, and Blinkist doubles the benefits I get from a workout. I exercise both my body and my brain.
Blinkist is adding new titles from best of lists, so you're always getting the most powerful ideas in a made-for-mobile format.
You'll find timeless classics like The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and current bestsellers like You Are a Badass, How to Stop Doubting Your Greatness and Start Living an Awesome Life.
And right now, for a limited time, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Go to Blinkist.com/nobody to start your free 7-day trial.
That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist, Blinkist.com/nobody to start your free 7-day trial. You can cancel at any time.
Blinkist.com/nobody.
I thought it was so relatable, but so just gut-wrenching how you wrote that the more important her husband became on the political scene, the less important that she was in his life. What impact did this have on her self-esteem?
Well, she was, she had 4 children. She was running around taking care of the children. And then as a congressman's wife, she had a lot of obligations to be part of the wives club and, do a lot of lunches and teas, go to social events in the evenings. And so she was always, on his arm and just, being pulled in so many different directions. I think a lot of women feel like that at some point, working mothers, and stay-at-home mothers. And at that point, she was a stay-at-home mother, but with all these other obligations, she, did have a job as well. So she went into a depression and eventually sought psychiatric help, which she was very open about, and that psychiatrist helped her self-esteem. And she realized she had to give a little more time to herself and not give everything to her children and her husband.
And how did her life change when her husband, Gerald Ford, became vice president?
Well, it was just amazing. It was something she didn't want. She didn't believe that he was going to become vice president. Just to remind everybody of the history, it was when Nixon was president and Spiro Agnew was vice president, and Vice President Agnew resigned due to an investigation into tax evasion. So he resigned, and so then Nixon had to appoint a vice president. And Gerald Ford was on the short list, but Betty was in complete denial that he would ever be chosen. Well, he was chosen, so that was the first surprise. And in December of 1973, he became vice president. Well, meanwhile, while all this was going on, the Watergate investigation was happening. And in August of 1974, just, barely 8 months later, he becomes president when Nixon resigned. So in the span of 10 months, Betty went from being a congressman's wife to First Lady of the United States. She was just thrust onto the world stage, and she was terrified. And it was, can you even imagine?
No.
Yeah, that must have been such a challenging time for her.
Yeah, and I know you said that she said that was the saddest day of her life.
It was, and that was something I found really surprising. And the reason it was so sad was she felt sad for Pat Nixon. The Nixons had been very good friends of the Fords. Ever since they moved to Washington, they were friends with the Nixons. And she felt so sorry that Pat was in this position. It was really humiliating. And then also there was the sadness that here she was going to be living in a fishbowl, basically. And it's not really what she wanted.
And how did she feel about her children being thrust into the spotlight when her husband suddenly became president?
Well, her oldest son, Mike, was married, so he wasn't there. He had and his wife had moved away. The 2 older sons were kind of in and out. They were in college. And so it was really Susan that was home full time. She was at an all-girls boarding school called Holton Arms in Maryland, but she lived in the White House and then, would go to school and come home on the weekends. So she, she tried to protect the children as much as she could, but everybody was fascinated, and the press wanted as much information as possible. And her kids were very outspoken. At one point, Jack, the second oldest son, told a reporter that he had smoked marijuana. And I mean, this was in the 70s, and it was illegal, obviously. So now you have the president's son going around saying that he's smoking marijuana.
Yeah.
And so they caused some problems at times.
Oh my gosh. Well, what did Betty's kids say that she was like as a mother?
They, she was very devoted. She went to all their sporting events and everything, but it's clear that she developed a dependency on prescription medication. She had an incident when the kids were young in which they diagnosed it as a pinched nerve. She was in excruciating pain and ended up in the hospital. And the doctors put her on prescription pain meds. And from then on out, she, was taking all these medications. Add to that Valium that her psychiatrist prescribed when she was depressed. And and then add to that her nightly vodka tonic, which was something that, people did back then, having 2 martini lunches and a drink at 5 o'clock every day. So she was having this really dangerous mix of pain medications and alcohol. And there were times when she was kind of in a fog, but the kids didn't know any different. I think children of alcoholics will tell you that, to them, that's normal. That's what they've grown up with. So they really didn't see it as a problem until it developed much later. It became clear that she had this problem. The good thing for the family was they had this housekeeper named Clara that was always there. And all 4 of the children had a very close bond with Clara, and they said she was their mother when their mother wasn't able to be there for them.
Wow. Well, how did Betty Ford's dependency on pills and alcohol change after her husband was no longer president?
So she kept it pretty well under control in the White House. She was still being prescribed medication, and there were signs at times. Some of her assistants told me that, she just was slurring her words, and they were afraid she couldn't speak in public. So people protected her. When Gerald Ford lost the election in 1976 to Jimmy Carter, all of a sudden now Jimmy Carter's president on January 20th, 1977, and the Fords are out. So she goes from being first lady, and she really blossomed as first lady. We haven't even talked about her issues with breast cancer, which I'll go into a little bit later. But she, all of a sudden, she's no longer first lady. They moved to California, and she's alone and lonely. And it was really, that's when I think everything just exacerbated. And by the next year, her family realized something was terribly wrong with her. She was not the woman she used to be. She was almost 60 years old. And a year after they left the White House, the family did an intervention.
And can you tell us more about that intervention?
Sure. One of the things in the book that's, all new information is I spoke with Betty Ford's personal assistant at the time, Caroline Coventry, and she had never talked about this before. It was a very painful time for her as well. She was about 28 years old, and she had become Betty's personal assistant after they left the White House. And she was with her day in and day out, whereas by now all 4 of the kids were grown and on their own, so they weren't around. And Jerry Ford was traveling, making speeches, and she saw this downward spiral. So she and Susan tried to do their own little mini intervention at one point, and Betty threw them out of the house. She was in complete denial, and she said, "Get out of here, you monsters, and don't ever come back." So they got a doctor involved and got the whole family together. and went to the house one day. It was a week before her 60th birthday, and they all showed up and surprised her basically, and went around the room and said, "We're doing this because we love you." And they each had written down on a piece of paper things that Betty had done that had hurt them in one way or another when she had been on medication or, had drank too much. So they each had their own incidents to tell her how deeply personal this was to them and to make her realize that indeed she had a problem. And it takes a lot of courage for a family to do that, because you're going to be hurting the person you love, but you're doing it to try to convince them to see that they have this problem and they need help. So by the end of a couple of really tearful, painful hours, Betty agreed that she needed to get help. And there were no Betty Ford centers back then.
Right.
So the only place, or the closest place for her to go, actually, and the best, was Long Beach Naval Hospital, which treated sailors. And so she went into a rehab program, and she was there with a bunch of sailors. She was shown to a room with 4 beds. So she didn't have a private room, and she wasn't happy about that at first.
Mm-hmm.
But she finally agreed to do it, and had to go through a horrible detox process, because she had been taking these medications for so many years and had such a mixture in her body that it really was bad. So by the end of the month, she came out, and while she was in rehab, she put out a press release telling the world that she was addicted to prescription medication and alcohol. And in that moment, she really changed the stigma, or took off the stigma of addiction, by saying, look, if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. And I know there are people just like me out there who have the same issue, the same disease, and it's okay to ask for help.
And what was her goal then in creating the Betty Ford Center?
Well, that didn't come about until a year later. She was involved in an intervention for her friend Leonard Firestone of the Firestone Tire Company. And when he came out of rehab, he was a new person, and he saw how Betty had become a new person. And he said, you and I together, with our name and our resources, we need to start a place for people to go. And they went around and they raised money. They got space at the Eisenhower Medical Center in Rancho Mirage, California. And at first it had some, long technical name. And one day somebody said, we really need to have a better name for this. I think we should call it the Betty Ford Center. And she was at first really against that. She didn't want her name on the center. And the reason was, in the back of her mind, she thought, if I put my name on the center, I really can never have another drink again. This is it. I'm putting myself out there. And everybody convinced her that it was the best thing to do. So she put her name on the center. And from that moment forward, she was deeply involved with it. Every day she was there seeing patients. She gave a talk once a month to the patients for, as long as she could, for the next 25 years or so. And was just a real inspiration to thousands upon thousands of people.
You mentioned as well, just taking a step back, her struggle with breast cancer. Can you talk to us about that?
Yes. So 7 weeks after she became First Lady, now remember, she said that was the saddest day of her life. She became First Lady. 7 weeks later, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She just happened to go in for an exam because her friend had an appointment and said, come on, Betty, I know you've been so busy. You haven't had time to get checked, so come with me to the doctor. Well, the doctors found a suspicious lump, and the standard procedure at that time, which I found this astonishing, was that they would do a biopsy. They'd put you under general anesthesia to do the biopsy, and then they'd test the tissue. And if it was malignant, then while you were still under general anesthesia, they would remove the breast, do a radical mastectomy. Mm-hmm. So Betty went into the hospital, A, not knowing if she had cancer, just knowing there was a lump, and B, not knowing if she was going to come out having one of her breasts removed. And once again, she realized that she was not the only person going through this terrifying thing. And they put out a press release from the White House explaining what was happening. And she was just very open and honest with people. And she changed women's health care literally overnight, because when it came out that she had breast cancer, and then there were pictures of her, in the hospital smiling and saying, look, my prognosis is good because they caught it early. Women started lining up at clinics to go get their breasts checked. And this was a time when you couldn't say breast on television. People whispered about cancer. There were no walkathons. There were no, diagrams of how to do a breast exam. Doctors didn't ask you if you'd had your mammogram. It just wasn't talked about. So all of a sudden, it became part of the national conversation. And she got like 35,000 letters the first week from people thanking her for her courage and for being able to talk about it now. So people were having conversations with their spouses about breast cancer, and people who had been through it. They really admired her and respected her for going public.
That wasn't the only tough thing that she had to deal with when her husband was president. There were 2 assassination attempts on his life. How did she cope with those?
Yeah, that was, and they were sort of back to back within a span of 2 weeks in September of 1975. She, it was something. Of course, they have Secret Service agents around them. And so the whole reason you have Secret Service agents around is because people are nutty out there and there are assassination attempts. So she, from that point on, she was really nervous every time he left the White House. She always wanted to be with him, but if he went on a trip without her, she would stand at the balcony of the White House and would wave goodbye as the helicopter left the South Lawn. And she'd always say a little prayer and, just thanked the Secret Service agents for doing their job, because they are the ones that saved him on those 2 attempts.
Her legacy goes so far beyond just being a really good first lady and somebody who was on the arm of the president. What do you think her greatest impact has been on society?
Well, it's so many issues. If you've had anybody in your family deal with breast cancer or cancer of any kind, or with addiction issues, her legacy is that research and funding into those areas has increased dramatically simply because she was able to speak out about it and to go public with her own very personal issues. So she's helped over 100,000 people at the Betty Ford Center alone, but how many more thousands of people have gone to other treatment centers because it's now okay to ask for help it almost became a status symbol in Hollywood at one point, to go to the Betty Ford Center. And I just think her legacy is just amazing. It really has, a lot of people have said, surpasses that of her husband's.
Yeah, I think you may be very right about that. Our show is called Nobody Told Me, and we always ask our guests, what's your nobody told me lesson? So what is it that nobody told you about the life of Betty Ford, or about research, writing a book, or your own life that you'd like to share with us?
Well, nobody told me that I would fall in love with my subjects. And my first subject was Clint Hill, a Secret Service agent. And as I was researching and getting to know him while writing books, I literally fell in love with him. And we we became partners and have written 3 other books. And the same thing happened with Betty Ford. Even though she's gone, and I never met her, I fell in love with her. And to the point that when I got to the end of the book, and I guess it's a little bit of a spoiler alert, but she dies at the end. And I was sobbing as I was writing the part about her funeral and about her attending her husband's funeral. I get so deeply involved in the lives of these people, and I really fell in love with Betty Ford, and I hope readers do too.
Lisa, how can people connect with you on social media, and how can they learn more about the book?
I have a website, lisamccubbin.com, and that's McCubbin. I'm on Twitter. It's Lisa_McCubbin. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. So I'm trying to get the word out there. The books are available at most major bookstores, Amazon, and it's also an audiobook and an ebook. So however you like to get your books, it's available.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Really had a good time with you, ladies.
Our thanks to Lisa McCubbin. Again, her latest book is called Betty Ford, First Lady, Women's Advocate, Survivor, Trailblazer. And again, her website is lisamccubbin.com. I'm Jan Black.
And I'm Laura Owens.
You're listening to Nobody Told Me. Thank you so much for joining us.